Alrighty, welcome back to everything you need to know about the Season 1 dungeons for the War Within dungeons. I'm going to be going over and covering basically everything that you need to know, the most important things of each and all of the dungeons for War Within Season 1. And if you like Mythic Plus content, you've probably come to the right place, as I'm going to be uploading daily or multiple times a week Mythic Plus content as the season progresses. So if you enjoy that kind of thing, make sure you leave a like and subscribe. Additionally, I'm going to timestamp down at the bottom each and every single dungeon. Kind of how I view this video to be used is like right before you go into the dungeon, you end up watching the specific section for that dungeon. That way you're not left out to dry. That way you're actually able to understand what is going to be going on with the dungeons themselves. There's also a couple of key Weakauras and add-ons that I kind of want to highlight. First and foremost, there's a nameplate cooldown Weakaura, which attaches all of the boss and mob abilities to your nameplate frame, allowing you to know the ICD or the internal cooldown of these abilities. It's very useful for whenever you're trying to learn mechanics, how they function, what they do, and when they're coming out. Because I feel like a lot of times on trash mechanics specifically, just having this pre-existing knowledge of when the abilities are happening, that's important. The secondly, I'm going to link is a dungeon Weakaura pack. Now, this one's designed by Tirna. Basically, it's a Weakaura pack that's designed by a high-end player for high-end players, but I found that it's very, very useful for the player base in mass. Now, there are some sound effects that happen with this Weakaura pack. Personally, I turned them off. I found that a lot of players actually do enjoy the Weakaura packs. They tell you things like defensives, they tell you things like whenever specific mechanics are happening, but I think that this Weakaura pack that Tirna has designed is probably the best Weakaura pack that you're going to find for dungeons that's just like very generalized. First thing you probably need to know about all the dungeons is there's a couple of specific themes and things that are actually quite good inside the dungeons. I think that Poison Dispel and Curse Dispel are all quite strong, and so having those different Poison and Curse Dispels, at least in like some broader composition, is going to be beneficial. Of course, before each and every single dungeon, I'm going to talk about what Dispel is very good and how it's particularly useful, but I think that just knowing that there's profession buffs and specific Poison and Curse Dispels that you're going to want to know for each and every single dungeon, that's going to be important going into these videos. All right, first and foremost, we can talk about Ara-Kara. Ara-Kara has two of these themes present. First off, has tailoring. Tailoring, there you basically click on some of these inactive Nerubians that are just on the ground. They'll be glowing with yellow. And what it allows you to do is you pick up a 12-second stun. Now, the 12-second stun is a single target stun, but it can stun mini-bosses, and it can stun a bunch of other garbage mobs that are in the dungeon, and they also last for 60 seconds. Now, not all mini-bosses can be stunned, like the ones at the very beginning can't be stunned, but like the Hauler towards the end, that's a potential mob that can be stunned, and it actually ends up delaying some of the more interesting stuff. So even potential lieutenants that otherwise in other instances wouldn't be stunnable, that one's really good. Talking about the first trash area a little bit, there's a couple of things that you need to know. First off, kicking attendants on the Resonant Barrage and kicking the mini-bosses, those are probably the two most important things. Also, getting kicks on the bolts from the attendants, that's also going to be pretty obnoxious. Those attendants have a tendency to actually get stuck pretty far, so having like a Death Knight to be able to grip the attendant on top of the mini-bosses is going to be pretty problematic. Basically, you end up having to kill 3 mini-bosses to spawn the boss. If you've done this dungeon on Heroic, you probably understand that. All 3 mini-bosses do slightly different things. The left one is the caster. It ends up casting a fear, so you have to have a melee kick on this at any given moment. Otherwise, the fear is going to be going off. It is a 15-second lockout, so one melee can cover it the entire time, though. The middle mini-boss is a massive AoE, and so your healer needs to start like pre-ramping the moment that this mini-boss gets pulled, and you need to be pressing a defensive within the first like 3 or 4 seconds of this mini-boss being pulled. The AoE catches people off guard, especially once you start to get to higher levels. And so making sure that you're pre-defensiving, you're making sure that you have your healing getting ramped up on that middle mini-boss, that's going to be super important. The right mini-boss is much easier. It's just a bonus ground effect. Now, at higher level keys, whenever that mini-boss ends up living for a really long time, it can become obnoxious, particularly for your melee DPS. But a little bit of a tip is that the melee DPS can actually walk around and walk behind that mini-boss to make sure that they're able to maintain as large melee uptime as possible. Jumping into the first boss has 2 main mechanics. Both of them are mass AoE effects, Gossamer Onslaught and Alarm Shrill. Basically, the strategy here is you kill spiders and you don't get hit by the Gossamer ground effect. The healer's actually going to have a pretty hard time on the Gossamer AoE. So the Gossamer AoE does about the same damage as the Alarm Shrill in 2 seconds less. However, the deal with the Gossamer is that it has a ground effect attached to it, and so healers, particularly things like a Disc Priest, maybe even some of these healers, if they don't have Spatial Paradox or they don't have Spirit Walker's Grace available, can have a hard time healing that Gossamer. Whereas, at least for the Alarm Shrill, if you have a strong healing CD prepped for it, it should be a little bit easier. In the past, you were able to kite platform to platform. That's no longer the case. Additionally, if the boss eats any of the little spiders, the boss maintains a 60% damage increase, meaning that basically you're going to be wiping. Triple melee comps are going to kind of struggle on this boss in particular to be able to get really strong boss uptime, and so you're going to be able to have to kite the boss kind of close to some of the adds to where they're able to continue to do damage to the boss while also maintaining AoE on those adds. The second area, it's got a couple of mobs that really matter. First off, there's the Hulking Bloodguard. It has a 50% DR on surrounding mobs, meaning that you don't want the mobs actually standing on top of the Bloodguard. You also, every single time you pull a Bloodguard, you want to be focusing it down. I've seen a lot of people in heroic dungeons pull the Bloodguard with other mobs. Do not do this. Like, you are going to really hurt your ability to be able to kill the Hulking Bloodguards if you're stacking their 50% DR with one another. Their bit is that they don't have a DR on themselves, and so you're incentivized to be prioritizing them down. And so things like an Enhancement Shaman or an Arcane Mage are really, really good in this area. Additionally, there are the Alarm Beetles. They cast this an ability called Alarm Shrill. Now, it's an 8-second long cast, but it must be stopped. If it's not stopped, then they summon another Hulking Bloodguard, which, again, not a very efficient mob, especially if it gives 0 count from the Alarm Beetle. I found it personally pretty easy to solo the Alarm Beetles on like an Aug Evoker. However, if you're in like an uncoordinated group or something like that, just throw your stops at them. These mobs aren't really difficult to deal with if anybody's paying attention. Again, 8-second cast. There is a big punishment if you let it go off, but it should be pretty easy to deal with. Second boss. Second boss is actually quite easy. I don't really think that we have too much to cover. Kicking the web mage is pretty important. There was a time on the beta where these web mages would actually spawn during the circle mechanic. That's no longer going to be the case, so you should have an easier time of kicking the web mages. You just really want to get those grouped on top of the boss. The other thing is you have to press a defensive whenever you end up getting the dot on you. There's Weakauras packs and whatever else for this, and so if you press a defensive whenever you get the dot on you, you'll be more or less fine. So for the third boss area, people most of the time are pulling up the left side. This is due to count. This is also due to like the hauler down the middle actually not being a very efficient mob in terms of time to kill versus like how much count it gives versus also how deadly it is because it has an infinitely stacking damage buff. And so people were mostly pulling up the right side. The wing carriers are pretty obnoxious, but you can actually pull them with that first mini boss that's standing there. The wing carriers, how they work is once they take any point of damage, they drop this goop that's on the ground and it'll end up rooting you. But the big issue with the winged carriers is that they'll leap on a random target and doing decent damage. These are mobs that you really want to pre-wall the go on. Beyond this, there's those caster mobs as well that are those caster lieutenants. They only require 1 melee kick, so you can assign a melee kick to each and every single one, and it shouldn't be too bad. Another thing is if you actually end up getting gooped by the winged carrier's dot, it summons a slime. All you have to do is CC the slime, and then you're out of it. Okay, so the final boss is one that I think that people are going to really struggle on. We really want a Poison Dispel, and I talked about Poison Dispel at the very beginning of this dungeon. This is why we want the Poison Dispel. Whenever you actually get dispelled, the dispel shoots out waves from your character, and you can kind of see where the waves are being angled. The dot of the Poison Dispel actually hits very, very hard. So things like Poison Cleansing Totem are really good. Things like individual Poison Dispel are really good. But you really don't want that dot on you for any extended period of time. Or if you do have that dot on you, you really want to be making sure that you're pressing a defensive. The other mechanic is killing the blood workers to drop those purple puddles that we were talking about from the winged carriers. Whenever you get in that purple puddle, the slime spawns, same thing, you CC it, and then but the puddle prevents you from getting sucked in from the boss's suck mechanic. Now, some people, and I've seen this in heroic dungeons, they actually don't get slimed, and then they end up getting hit by the suck. Whenever you get hit by the suck, say you even live it, say you're playing a tank or whatever, you get a 75% damage down for 15 seconds. This is largely unacceptable. You basically just want to get slimed. That's definitely going to be your best bet as a whole, is making sure that you're getting out of that. Additionally, right after that happens, you want to make sure that you're getting out of that slime with any instant CC and get out of there as fast as possible. Basically, getting stuck in there is a recipe for you to get hit by the ground effect and just die 100 to 0. Okay, so that's everything you need to know about Ara-Kara. So the next dungeon that we have is City of Threads. And I had to cook up a couple of diagrams for City of Threads because first off, the profession buff is based off of Engineering, Rogue, and Priest. And what it is it's 15% damage and 15% healing for 25 seconds. This is very good. players on the beta were actually generally pulling around where this engineering buff's locations were. And as you can see on the screen right here, you can see all 4 of the locations of this engineering buff. Basically, what people were doing were they were pulling up to the first engineering buff. They were doing the first pull with Lust. They would then go to the second engineering buff, and they would do like a corner pack. And then they would actually walk around the right side, get the third engineering buff, and pull straight into the boss with that 15% damage gain. And then after the boss, they would actually walk to the left side and then pull some of the trash with that final engineering buff. I don't expect that to be like a really common pug strategy, but that's just what people were doing on the beta. I have this diagram here just so you can see roughly where the engineering buffs are. In addition to the profession buff, what you need to know about City of Threads, Poison Dispel is very good for here. It's only good after the second boss area, but the Poison Dispel is still very solid in here, and you do want one. So the trash before the first boss, the things that you need to know, the Big Beetle, it puts a dot on all players. It's actually very deadly. There's also the Herald of Ansarek. This is a mob that has a kick rotation on Twisted Thoughts. These are probably the 2 most dangerous mobs that are in this entire area. There's also other smaller beetles that you really want to kick as well. And that's why having a lot of interrupts and single target interrupts on this area is important. I think that the Herald and the beetle damage in conjunction with one another, these are mobs that you don't really want to pull together all too often. You really want to try to avoid pulling them together as often as you reasonably can. Now, there's sometimes that you can't avoid that, and if you can't avoid that, making sure that you're not pulling them with any of the smaller Webmancer caster mobs. If you pull them with all of those, you're probably going to wipe to getting cast on too much. First boss, I would describe it as actually pretty easy, assuming that your tank knows the movement. If your tank doesn't know the movement, you're probably going to wipe to this boss. The general premise is that you have to stay inside the circle, but you need to be spread perma. There's also these prideful orbs that spawn off of players, and generally the strategy is you're pre-spread, you dispel one very quickly and have the other one time out. What this does is, first and foremost, it allows you to dodge the frontal a lot easier. Secondly, it allows players to only have to dodge one set of orbs at a time, because I've found personally that if you have to dodge 2 sets of orbs at once, it can become pretty problematic. So the healer wants to make sure that they're pre-spread, make sure that everybody else is pre-spread, and then dispel somebody instantly. Then at that point, it's just kind of a free-for-all to make sure that you're dodging and being consistent with your movement. The boss also does AoE. The AoE isn't like insane. If you press any group defensive like Rallying Cry, Zephyr, AMS, something like that, you'll be more or less fine. If your healer has any healing CD, you're also okay. And this includes something like Chain Heal, because it's not that much damage. It's like a decent amount, but it's not like an insane amount. But whenever the boss does the AoE, the boss drops an expanding puddle beneath it. I have found that tanks in heroic dungeons do not move this boss. However, the millisecond that this AoE goes off and is finished, your tank needs to be immediately moving the boss. Drag the boss away quickly. You want to kind of optimize space depending on where you're playing. So you kind of want to be up against the previous puddle whenever you're getting ready to drop the next one. But that's the only thing that you need to know. I don't think that this boss is very difficult, but I think that it's a boss that you need to know mechanically what happens, and then as you know it, it becomes a lot easier. All right, so I had to make another diagram for the second trash area. And as you can see on screen here, basically this is a Queen or Eye of the Queen mini game thing. Basically, you end up killing the mini boss to get an Eye extra action button. But the Eye extra action button doesn't necessarily have to be used to activate the Eye of the Queen. You can, in general, just tag the mob. And what you have to do is you have to kill all 4 Eyes of the Queen to be able to progress to the next boss. Whenever you actually end up killing all 4 of these Eyes of the Queen, then you walk up to one of the mini bosses that's on the far right-hand side, and then you're able to deal with it. So let's talk about this diagram right here. What you can do is, first and foremost, whenever you walk up to this area, instead of killing that mini boss solo, you can actually walk a little bit forward and tag the first Eye of the Queen. You have to tag it with ranged ability, and then the Eye of the Queen, you can fight it with the mini boss simultaneously. This is going to speed up your dungeon drastically. It basically cuts an entire pull from the dungeon. Beyond this, the Eye of the Queen should not be fought with other Eye of the Queen. If you fight 2 of these at once, you might be dying. But how it works is there are 4 quadrants. And what the 4 main quadrants have is there are 3 different spawn locations in the 4 main quadrants, except for the first one, where there's only one set static location. And of these 3 locations, basically there's a generalized path that you should be running to make sure that you're able to activate the mini bosses. And you can see on screen here, I kind of mark them 1, 2, 3 as to what order and which direction you should be running. And so after you kill one in each quadrant, you should then move to the next quadrant. What the fastest way of doing this is you end up going left, and then you go towards that middle back area towards the boss, and then you come back around to the right side. What this does is after you end up killing the third eye or the fourth eye of the queen, then you're able to activate the mini boss that runs and then goes and clears the web for you. And that reduces the amount of travel time substantially. What I will say is I think the purple dudes are really fake, and if you end up following the purple dudes too much, it can actually lead you into like really weird spots, or it'll lead you like around in a lot of weird areas. I think another helpful tip is in that first left quadrant that you're going to be going to, whenever you walk to that outside balcony platform, if you actually hug the wall of the house a bit, if you have your extra action button pop up, you can tell immediately that the mini boss is going to end up being in the house. The alternative is like we're tagging the packs that are both outside, and whenever you tag those packs that are outside, those mini bosses will activate instantly. And so that will actually allow you to save a few seconds on being able to quickly determine where the Eye of the Queen is. This is a mini game that if you end up taking too much time, you'll actually bleed a lot of time here. So making sure that you look at this graphic and know where it's going to be is going to be important. I'm also going to leave these graphics linked down in the description if you're looking for something like that. I would describe the second boss as actually pretty fast-paced and has a decent amount of mechanics. VX moves, NX ports. Most of the mechanics are going to end up being dodging. The icicles and the dagger are like these dots that are on you, and these are the most dangerous. These are the times that you want to be pressing into defensives. There's also an ability called Rhyme Dagger, and it's a tank soak. The mini bosses will also start to do a synchronized dash ability. In theory, the best way of dealing with this, and you're going to see high-end teams do this, but this is not going to happen realistically in pucks. In theory, though, the best way of dealing with the synchronized dash is to aim the mini bosses over and over again into the wall. That will actually cancel their dash short and then allow your melee DPS to have a little bit more uptime. The downside is then that they port into the middle of the room, so it's like pretty useless. But in theory, that's what you're going to see in terms of optimizing melee DPS uptime. Third boss trash area. This third boss trash area was skipped a lot. There was a long time on beta where it was giving 0 count. Now that's no longer the case. This trash does give a little bit more count. But a lot of people are playing trash in the first area and playing trash at the end area because this trash that's after the third boss actually has insane tank buster mechanics. There is a mini boss that's in this area, and this is the reason that City of Threads has a very nice, I would describe it as Poison Dispel, is because this mini boss, you actually want to pull this mini boss with a couple of the casters, you end up kicking the casters, and then you want to rip as many Poison Dispels as possible on that big beetle. We're focusing down that big beetle. He actually doesn't do like a ton of damage or anything like that, but trying to focus him down, get the Poison Dispels out, drop the Poison Cleansing Totem, press like Cloak of Shadows or something like that. That is very valuable, and it actually speeds it up a lot because if you're actually pulling that with the 2 packs of trash on top of him, that's a very efficient pull. Some of the other third boss trash area that's inside the house, they changed this a little bit from the beta. Basically, the caster mobs, they knock you back, but then they put a pretty brutal dot on you. The big hulking guys, they do a small AoE. It's not like, it's over about like 8 seconds, I would say. And it can kill you. It can do 100% of your health if you're not pressing anything. But if your healer is pressing any heals on your entire group, you should be fine. The big thing that you need to know, though, is killing the slimes is going to be activating the third boss. So the fastest strat actually involves you pulling the trash up the left side and then immediately beelining into the boss room to kill off those slimes. Then you finish off the trash as it's trickling in, and you pull the third boss as he takes like 20 seconds of RP to be able to spawn. And so that's the fastest way of getting the boss spawned. Third boss, very easy. Basically, you soak orbs, you get a heal absorb, don't let the orbs contact the boss. Boss does an AoE at 100 energy. Press the defensive for that. Before talking about the last boss, we have to talk about the 2 mini bosses that are in front of the last boss. Basically, you want to pull the left side mini boss, and like as you were getting webbed for the first time by the left side mini boss, you actually want to be pulling the big beetle. That will desync the webbing from getting the AoE dot on you, kind of similar to what we saw from the heralds in the very beginning area, those big beetles. You really don't want the dots on you at the exact same time, so there's a very static time at which you want to pull it, and typically it's going to end up being delayed about 10 to 15 seconds. Last boss, I think that this boss is brutal. It's kind of similar to the Yasma of Season 3, where this is a very movement-intensive fight. I'm probably going to end up making a video very specifically about this boss. It's Orianna from League of Legends. Basically, it summons orbs, moves them around pretty frequently with a ground effect. The ground effect sucks to see. I'm telling you in advance, you're going to have a hard time seeing this ground effect with any consistency, but it's going to one-shot you 100-0, and you're going to desk slam. There's also webs that root players, and you have to use damage to break them out. You can use freedom style effects, such as, you know, shapeshifting from Druid or Freedom or Tiger's Lust or stuff like that, to be able to get you out. That's pretty valuable. The issue is that you're on a timer of getting yourself and your group broken out. So you actually want to stay stacked on this fight as often as possible for this web effect. Additionally, it's really good to be stacked for group healing. There's also a dot on everybody that gets put out periodically. This dot is very dangerous whenever it's combined with the ground slam effect. So this ground slam effect, whenever you have the dot on you, it can 100 to 0 you, or it can like 2-tap you or something like that. So that's when you want to be pressing your group defenses. That's when we want to be pressing Rally. That's when we want to be pressing Zephyr. Spirit Link Totem is great there. Also, this fight is pretty heavy movement for your healer. So effects like Spatial's Paradox, Spirit Walker's Grace are very, very good on this boss. Then there's a tank AoE, and your tank is going to kill you the first time that you've seen this. I'm just telling you in advance, the tank is going to be killing some melee DPS because they didn't get out of the group fast enough. What you want to do as the tank is you actually want to tank this AoE into the middle of the room. So you're staying stacked for the entire duration of the fight. The tank AoE circle comes out, the tank beelines into the middle of the room, the melee DPS continue to hit the boss. And that's going to allow you the most amount of movement optimization on this fight. This fight is very difficult. I suspect that this is going to be a pug killer. I suspect that I'm going to end up making a very specific video similar to Yasma talking about how to optimize the movement on this boss. All right, we got the Donny B. So the Donny B is pretty interesting. Pretty unique dungeon. There's the beginning trash area. There are some important trash mobs. They do a little bit of AoE on you whenever they put the circle suck effect on you. I would say that there's nothing insanely mechanical about the first area of trash. The first pull is typically done in like a double, and you just like lust it. I've seen some people in the beta, they did the double on the boat for the second pull of the dungeon and lusted that instead. The thing that you need to know about the beginning trash area, though, is that you're going to be dragon riding. You're going to be dragon riding from boat to boat to activate a bomb. Generally speaking, you're going to be either going left or right. Somebody's probably going to ping which direction you go to. You kill the trash pack that's on the boat. You click the bomb, you go to the other side, and then you click the bomb, and then you go back to the middle, and then you fight the first boss. First boss, Speaker Shadow Crown. There's a heal absorb mechanic that goes out on players whenever it's dispelled. The healer really wants to get these players topped up, but this heal absorb effect isn't like that large. Now, it's not great to have it lingering onto players, so you do want to get it cleared off as often as possible, but that's the primary mechanic of this fight. There's also a tank buster during the circle phase. So basically, every so often, this boss does something similar to the first boss of Halls of Atonement, similar to like Trilliax with like the beams, where it's going to cut people off into quadrants. The tank has an unavoidable tank buster that's during this ring phase. And that's like almost 100% of the damage that the tank is going to be taking here, is this undodgeable tank buster. But you need to know that it's there, otherwise you're going to get one-shot by it occasionally. What I will say for Mythic Plus is by far the most important mechanic is the boss energy and dropping puddles. So whenever the boss hits 100 energy, you know that puddles are going to be coming out. The puddles can only be dropped on your ranged DPS players. So making sure that as a ranged DPS player, you're playing pretty far from the boss is going to be important, because then you're going to be screwing your melee otherwise if not. And it's kind of hard to move the boss. Now, it's possible with kicks and stuff like that to get the boss moved, but it's really obnoxious to get this boss moved. Additionally, there's a dragon riding phase at 50%. The dragon riding circle is a little bit bigger than it appears, so try to be a bit further away from it. But what you also need to know is that the boss will fast drop the puddles out of the dragon riding phase. So that's the only time that it's not consistent with the 100 energy, is out of the dragon riding phase, the boss will fast drop the puddles, reset their energy, and then you're able to see it for the remainder of the fight. All right, let's talk about the city area and dragon riding down to the city. Now, I made another graphic here, similar to what we saw in City of Threads. Again, all the graphics are going to be linked down in the description in an Imgur folder if you're looking for all of the graphics. But the boss has 3 stacks of a debuff. Killing mini-bosses removes stacks of the debuff. Finding the mini-bosses on your own is very challenging. That's why I've made this graphic. So I've notated this graphic as where the mini-bosses are and which mini-boss you want to go into in what order. First mini-boss is Church. It's on the far right-hand side. This mini-boss is an Orb Lady. You might see some previews of like Dawnbreaker from earlier on in beta. This was a different mob for a very long period of time, but in general, you want to be going to, number 1, kill that lady in the church. You actually want to be pulling it down this landing, because they have the similar orb mechanic to what the boss is going to have, what we're going to talk about later. The orb does fall off damage, so you want to shoot this orb. The Dark Orb basically needs to go down this long ramp that you see right there. You also want to grab a bunch of trash that's surrounding or inside the church. This is where you're going to be getting a lot of your count. A lot of people were basically playing all the trash inside the church. Secondly, I've notated it as house. Basically, you land on top of this upper platform. Do not pull any of the trash that is surrounding the house. You can pull the trash that is out in front of it with the mini-boss, as this isn't too bad. Basically, what this mini-boss is a heal check. Every so often, this mini-boss does a large AoE. It's not too bad. I'm going to be straight up. This mini-boss is not too bad with the heal check that you're going to be able to have to go through, and making sure that you are pressing your defensives on it, making sure that you're able to dodge the frontals from the mobs that you pull with the mini-boss. That's the most important thing. If you pull any of the surrounding mobs, those mobs are brutal casters that put dots on you and grip you in and do bullshit. So don't pull any of those. I've Spatial Paradox accidentally pulled them a couple of times, but make sure that you don't pull them. Last mini-boss, I've notated as far. This mob has a Tank Buster Fear Circle mechanic attached to it. So you want to tank the mini-boss basically in a corner to where your tank's not going to get knocked back into any other trash mobs and stuff like that. What you generally want to do is you want to clear out the trash that's nearby far first. Not the stuff that's in the courtyard, but instead the stuff that's like in front of the house and like underneath this like bridge area that like far is notated by. Then you want to play that mini-boss by itself. You really don't want to be playing with a bunch of other trash. It can get a little bit sketch. It's possible to play it with some of the trash. You're probably going to see hiding groups playing with some of the trash because it's like time efficient, but it's not necessarily something that you want to do in a pug. You can also see the boss is notated by this walkway area as well. And so that's actually very important to know where the boss is going to be patrolling. Additionally, you can like feign death reset the boss, but the boss is going to respawn exactly where you reset it at. And this includes wiping. So if you wipe, the boss is going to respawn where you wiped. So you need to know that about where you're pulling and resetting the boss. The second graphic that I have for the Dawnbreaker is showing where you're tanking the boss. Tanking the boss is only really good on this walkway area, similar for the church reason, where you get this dark orb mechanic. You have to shoot the dark orb up or down the ramp, and that's why you want to tank it in the middle here. There's also like a staircase next to where I have this boss marked. That's where your tank is going to be taking that Tank Buster knockback effect to not pull into any of the trash. Then it's going to make for the most consistent timing. I found that basically with that patrol that we saw before, you can get the boss to this spot at any given moment. Then you can shoot the Dark Orb up or down the platform. Lastly, the mini boss before the last boss gives 4.5%, 4.65% to be exact. So if you're close there, just know that you're going to be getting some count. The final boss, I would describe this boss as a raid boss. There's a phase 1 bomb mechanic where you end up throwing bombs into the boss. It's very similar to what you saw during Heroic. I actually don't think that this boss changes too much from Heroic to Mythic. Making sure that you're throwing the bombs in sync is important. The second wave of bombs, you actually want to throw all 6. The boss will deactivate and despawn the bombs after you throw 5. Realistically, throwing 6 is going to be your best bet, though, because it's going to do the most amount of damage to the boss. Phase 2 has these web circle mechanics. You must get out immediately. The dot that's attached to the web circles does a lot more damage than the web circles AoEing. What your healer wants to do is they want to be triage healing anybody who gets these web circles on them. It does a lot of damage. The AoE from it is pretty brutal. And the boss is still raining that dot on you permanently. And so the heal check on this fight is not something that is to be scoffed at. Next up, we got Grim Batol. Decurse is actually pretty important here. Soothe is also nice, but not required, but Decurse is the thing that's pretty important. First area trash. There's a couple of mobs that you really want to know about. By far the most important and obnoxious mob is the Twilight Destroyer. It does 2 main mechanics. First off, it'll put a debuff on players. The players will drop puddles. These puddles are cursed, by the way. They do instant damage from the ground effect, so you need to drop them in a good spot. The second mechanic is an AoE. The AoE is LOSable. Do not drop the puddles on your LOS spot. Like, this is me telling you this in advance. Do not drop the puddles on your LOS spot. You really want to LOS this dragon's AoE. Additionally, there are some dead dragons on the ground. If you walk over the corpse of these dragons, you will summon a destroyer. You don't want to do this most of the time. There are some routes that I've seen on the beta that people did it, but you most of the time do not want to do this. There's also a couple of other mobs that are in the first area. Twilight Earthcallers, that's a caster mob. It casts Bolts and Mass Tremor. Mass Tremor is a required kick. Bolts at a high level are a required kick, especially if it's in conjunction with any other AoE, but Mass Tremor is a mandatory kick, basically. The Overseer, this is the tank killer mob that I said the Soothe was nice for, where this mob will actually enrage the entire pack. You then want to Soothe the Destroyer, probably, because if somebody actually ends up getting hit with the AoE, they might end up dying. Then there's a bombing run, and there's very specific packs to kill. Basically, you want to kill this large patrolling 6-pack that's in the front left. That is like priority number 1. Priority number 2 of pack to kill is the pack that's in front of the first boss. Beyond that, we're basically shooting our number 2 on everything else. Our number 1 is our big hit. We only have 5 charges of that. So shoot our number 1 on those 2 packs that I notated, and shoot our number 2 on the rest of the shit. and basically at that point, we're going to be okay. First boss, not too hard. It's just like a battle of space management, making sure that you're dropping these circles in the right spot to make sure that you're not clogging up any specific lane is important. It's kind of similar to Heimdall from Halls of Valor, if you remember Dragonflight Season 1, where we're just looking for the safe spot. We're just moving back and forth across the room. We occasionally drop puddles. Second area, trash. So there's a mechanic where the caster will actually end up casting on the golems. Whenever the golems get stunned by the caster, they actually take 25% more damage. So if you walk in and you pull and the golem is stunned, hit the golem. It's a pretty big damage gain there. The Beguilers, those are the mobs that I was talking about that stun the golems. They have must-kick casts. There's also a stun that's attached to one of the must-kick casts. We cannot be letting them go off. You must kick them, please. Do not let your team sit a full stun. There's also the ability to be able to reset Thongus with meld and having him like respawn. How he respawns is he ends up spawning right back at where he started, channeling that little beam that shoots the fire out of the ground. And so respawning him is totally fine. You really want to clear out a bunch of trash before pulling the second boss, because the second boss actually has a decent amount of area denial. Depending on how long he's going to be living for is how much trash we want to kill beforehand. At high-end levels, you're clearing out probably 2 or 3 areas, like all 3 of the trash packs even potentially. Most of the time, it was just 2 areas in high keys on the beta, but in general, you probably want to clear out 2. Second boss, basically anytime he pulls out a new weapon, he does a little bit of AoE. The other main mechanic is that he does AoE whenever he pulls out his axes. And this is going to be you have like back-to-back pretty large healing checks. So this is a pretty bad healer fight. There's also, right off the rip of basically this boss works in cycles, where the first phase, he's going to be shooting a cone at players. Bait this cone well. There's going to be permanent fire that exists because of the cone. So you want to be like fully stacked and like pre-spawning this puddle. There's also a Molten Mace. Molten Mace mechanic is going to chase the tank. Your tank, if they get contacted by the boss while Molten Mace is active, they will die. 100 to 0. No exceptions. This is unacceptable for them to be in melee. I can't break these cuffs. There's no breaking these cuffs. You got to run. The boss is not too bad, though. Third trash area, Warlocks. Warlocks have a heal absorb and curse that's cast on the players. This is why you want the decurse, by the way. Having one of them on people is not too bad. It doesn't do as much damage lately as they nerf the shit out of it, but it's still pretty bad if you have multiple of these Warlocks curses onto players, and that's why having things like a mage, like a druid, like a shaman, very valuable in this dungeon, even an invoker, is very valuable in this dungeon. The Enforcers, they have a stacking rage. Every single time they contact a melee onto the tank, they stack a rage up to 10 stacks. At 10 stacks, your tank might die. It becomes very dangerous. You might have thought both of these mobs were bad. By far the worst mob here is the Lava Bender. The Lava Bender ascends at 50% HP and does an infinite damn pulsing AoE. This mob sucks. They also end up having Spell Haste, which I've seen desync the ground effect sometime. And so look for the ground effect cast name first and for the ground effect second, because if you're looking at the cast name, you're going to be able to dodge it a lot easier. Ascending 2 Lava Benders at once is almost 100% death 100% of the time. You really only want to ascend one at a time. It's kind of similar to like the first trash area in Mists of Tirna Scythe right before the first boss, where you have the bow breakers going off at a different time. If you have 2 ascending going off at the same time, that's almost unhealable for your healer. Third boss, 2 phases. First phase, you summon 1 at a time. The adds fixate players. They will blow up on you if they contact you. They will wipe you if they contact you. Dodge them. Second phase, boss does a knockback in conjunction with a dot that then goes out onto players. And then we'll also summon 2 adds. Again, do not get contacted by these adds. Do not get knocked back into these adds. Kill the adds as often as possible. Boss dies at 50%. Fourth boss, trash. There are these corruptors, which are basically the rune carvers from Weakauras Manor, where they channel on you and they suck you to death. And these mobs suck. They're very bad. I would describe them as incredibly overtuned, at least the last time I was in Grim Batol. There's also these mobs called mutated hatchlings, and they put a plus shadow damage taken debuff on you. And I think you can see where this is going, because if you get corruptor targeted while you have the mutated hatchling debuff on you, you die. You can feign death it and visit meld it off. This is probably the most important meld of the entire season. But yeah, that's how these mobs work. Fourth boss, I've had it described as a hentai movie. There's safe spots around the room, and you can kind of assess what's safe very quickly. So basically, it's going to be a contracting circle where the circle is going to converge into one safe spot. Whenever it converges into one safe spot, you really want to have people pre-spread. Like, you cannot have people stacked, because then the boss is going to summon circles onto players. And if you double tick one another, both your guys are dead. So pre-spreading, making sure that you're not stacked, making sure that you're not going to double tick the circle on top of one another happens. There's also these tentacles that are surrounding in the room. Good news, you can AMS and IBF out of the tentacles to soak them and clear them. So DK is very, very good on this boss. There's also this situation where you really want to kill adds at the right time relative to the AoE. The AoE is a shadow damaged AoE. And the mutated hatchlings that we're seeing on this boss is similar to the mutated hatchlings from the trash, where they put a plus shadow damage taken debuff on you. So what you want to do is you want to have the AoE going off, and you only have like a couple of stacks of the mutated hatchlings and potentially even 0 stacks of mutated hatchlings. Then you hard AoE them before the circle debuff comes out. That is in general how this fight is going to be looking. Miss Tirna Scithe, what is this dungeon doing here? It's back. And there's a dungeon solve Weakauras again. Now, this dungeon solve Weakauras is a little bit more complicated than the one in the past. I'm going to link a YouTube video from Robosaurus explaining this mist maze solve Weakauras. Basically, the patterns are the maze is very static. And so this Weakauras can almost solve the entire maze from the very beginning if you're following it. I'm going to link a YouTube video and the Weakauras down in the description, though, so you can check that out. There's also a checkpoint system in this dungeon. The first checkpoint can be gotten by anybody. There are a couple of different stuff, though. There's a wall that's starting on the left side. There's a second checkpoint after the boss. And then there's a wall with the mushrooms behind it. All three of those things can only be got by High Mountain Tauren, Nelf, Druid, and Herbalist. And so having one of those in your group is very valuable, partially due to the fact that that first wall is a massive time save over having to play and run around the other side. So, first area trash. You need to know that you're probably lusting the first boss and not the trash. The first boss in this dungeon is brutal, so saving your bloodlust for him is important. The villager the Tyrian villager does a stun mechanic. The stun mechanic can be avoided by things like Icebound Fortitude. Additionally, it can be melded, feigned deathed, invised off. So you really want to do that to that mob because it doesn't recast the stun. It is by far the highest priority mob in any time you pull it. The Drust Spike Claw. They leap and put a nasty bleed on people. If you stack in melee range of them, though, they don't leap and they don't put the bleed on people at all. So this first pull of the dungeon that you're going to see a lot of people do, stack in melee, hard stack for the Drust Spike Claws. Do not let yourself get bled. If you are the only ranged in your group and you let yourself get bled by all of these Spike Claws, you're going to be dying to the first pull of this dungeon and you're going to be really salty. Okay, first boss, Ingram Malloch. We got to have lust for this boss. How you want to do this first boss? So depending on the key level, I would say press your 1 minutes on pull. If you're doing a really low key, you don't press your 1 minutes on pull, but in general, you're going to press your short CDs on pull here. I think in general, overpressing offensive CDs on Droman is going to be the best benefit, though. You push Droman to 20% HP, and that's the most important thing, because whenever you push Droman to 20% HP, then Droman does a damage amp to Ingram Malloch. Ingram Malloch then takes 100% bonus damage. Your lust is going to be pressed whenever the first Droman is at 40% HP. This lust will carry through into the damage amp phase, and it's fine. Kicking Ingram Malloch. At a high level, kicks are required, but you got to make sure that you're kicking Ingra also out of the blue ground effect. There's going to be some amount of AoE damage that you're able to do to Ingram Malloch. Movement for melee comps is a lot harder on this boss than range. Ranged are really, really easy in this dungeon compared to melee. Also, what you need to know is Ingram Malloch has a DR applied to them after 15 or 20 seconds after they come out of the vulnerability phase where they're taking 100% increased damage. So thus, AoEing here is pretty useless. Let's talk about the maze. The maze actually changed a lot of bit since Shadowlands. First and foremost, pulling mobs through the wall will probably kill your tank. There's very specific mobs called Guardians. Guardians have an ability called Anima Slash. And while the Anima Slash is a tank buster, it's very dangerous, the passive ability that the Guardians have is what kills your tank. It's a plus percentage damage gain per mob that's around them. And so, in general, this is only going to be about 369%. However, if you pull an additional pack and they have a 20, or they have a 15, 18, 21% damage gain, they're going to 100 to 0 your tank. There's nothing avoiding that. So in general, you're not going to see people pulling through the wall too often anymore. Stalkers, bleed foxes, pretty scary bleed. It can't be dodged anymore. It can be, dodged by the effective dodge, but it can't be dodged by stunning them and making them recast, because now they recast. Defender. This mob is fucking annoying, by the way. Defender does a charge ability called Expel, I think. Disarm? I don't remember. It charges the player. It charges any ranged player. You really want to make sure that these mobs stay melee for your melee DPS. They also put a ground effect on the ground, which will insta-tick you. Additionally, the ground effect just has a DR applied to it. And this is really obnoxious for melee DPS. There's two other mobs that you need to know about. Tender, kick the heel. Shaper, kick the Bramblethorn coat. Kick both of those. Do not let either of those go off, otherwise we're wiping. Okay, so we made it through the maze. Now what? We go to Mistcaller. I don't have anything to say about this boss. Boss is pretty easy. Very straightforward. Played the guessing game during the intermission. End of dungeon trash. Very similar to how it was in the past. However, there's one key difference. Stag horns have been changed to have an ability called Acid Nova. It puts an increased damage taken debuff on you and does a large amount of AoE damage. This means that you cannot pull more than one stag horn at a time. Pulling them with a lot of acid gullet also becomes a bit tricky sometimes. Do not pull the stingers. Last boss, Gahoon. Not Gahoon, but Tredova, but Gahoon. You really want to stack and move as a group for the memory game. Only the tank ends up getting the Mind Link ability now, which is actually pretty good. But this also increases the importance of you wanting to be stacked. Basically, what will happen is the tank will move away from you and break the Mind Link on all the players. They should be pre-spread from your group. Necrotic Wake. I think the most frequently asked question are the golems still in the dungeon? How do they work without Kyrian anymore? No, the golems are gone. The hammers are also gone. The spears, shields, and anima orbs have all been changed a little bit. The spears now no longer do a lot of upfront damage, and they are just on the ground. Instead, they make the mobs take 25% increased damage. I'll talk about where to use them in a second, but let me just go through what the other abilities do. The shield now is a lot more usable. In the past, you would have to channel the shield to be able to get the DR. Now you just press it. The anima orb, still similar to how it was in the past, although now it really doesn't do much damage. It's just used for the silence effect, and it's used on very specific pulls. For the spears, Surgeon Stitchflesh is by far the most difficult part of this entire dungeon. The way you want to deal with this dungeon is kill Surgeon Stitchflesh, you're probably timing the key. You want to zug down the boss by using triple spear on that boss. Do not send it on a Marth. Do not send it on Blightbone. Do not send it on any trash. Send the spear, triple spear that guy. Please God, kill Surgeon Stitchflesh. For the shields and for anima orbs, I have found that these are most easily used on Amarth, the second boss. Use the shield after Amarth does the consumption phase and it's pulsing AoE on you. That's going to give you a 20% DR. This is not too bad. This helps your healer be able to heal through. For the Anima Orb, use the Anima Orb to help get the casters grouped. And that's how you basically want to use all of these effects. Let's talk about the trash specifically. You're allowed to pull anything in the first area that's not a gatekeeper. Gatekeepers aren't going to wipe you per se. I mean, they're not easy, but they're not going to wipe you per se. But they just don't give count relative to their HP. So pulling them is really bad. Corpse Harvesters in the first area. Mandatory kicks. They will do a cast that will stun you. These are required kicks. Please God, do not let a player get sucked and die. Blight Bags, large AoE on death. Press a defensive whenever you see those are going to die. You can also press like Zephyr or something like that. First boss, you're going to end up kiting around the safe space in the area. So making sure that you ended up killing enough mobs in the first area and kiting this boss around is going to be important. The boss is actually also very hard to reset. You see high-end groups actually kiting the boss even to like the entrance, depending on how long this fight's going to take. After you get past like the plus 12 level, this is not relevant for most people, but after you get past the plus 12 level, you're probably going to be one-shot 100 to 0 by the breath mechanic. The breath mechanic can be, avoided by things like intervene. It can, any evasion, feint, any AoE damage reduction like Zephyr, all works on it as well, though. Second trash area, there's a couple of stuff. Necromancers, they summon a lot of adds, and they cast Necrotic Bolt. You can actually cancel them summoning the adds. If you CC them the millisecond you see the Animate Death cast start, it doesn't make them summon adds. So, good news. Just press that shit insta. There's also Marauders, which these mobs have an AoE fear. One melee has to kick this. And they shield themselves. Whenever they shielded, if the shield breaks, they die. Any damage that you deal to them prior to this is not really relevant. Don't hit these mobs. It doesn't really matter. Only hit them whenever the shield is up. Last thing that's in the second trash area is Narzuda trash. Do not pull this. Also, there's another mini boss, the Skeletal Monstrosity. Do not pull this one either. Skip around them with Invis Pots. You can skip around with Rescue. You can't just walk around Natty. You have to skip with Mind Soothe, Invis Pot, Rescue, anything. Do not pull these mini bosses, Narzuda or the Skeletal Monstrosity. Let's talk about Amarth. Amarth, you actually really want to pull this boss straight into a corner. It actually helps the mobs spawn stacked and get them grouped up a lot easier. You want to kick Necrotic Bolt from the boss. It puts a heal absorb onto players, which is actually pretty dangerous if they're getting comboed. Your comp is going to be a little bit different depending on what you're playing, but figuring out how to get the mobs into the boss is important. The crossbowmen and the frostbolt casters are by far the most annoying. There's also a secret tech that if you played Shadowlands, you probably know. Paralysis, Turn Evil, Shackle Undead, Control Undead, they're all overpowered on this fight because if a mob is CC'd whenever Amarth does the, it's a ground effect that consumes all of the adds. If an add is CC'd whenever the consume happens, then the add doesn't explode and kill you. If there's an add that's not CC'd whenever the consume happens, then you just die. But if you paralysis it, Turn Evil, Shackle Undead, any of the casters that are standing out to the side, it's very valuable. Things like Turn Evil are very good on this dungeon. The Necropolis. There's a decent amount of abilities that didn't work up here. I think that a lot of them have been fixed. Breath of Eons, Force of Nature, Time of Need, Rescue didn't really work at the top in the Necropolis. I think they'd all work now. I'm not positive on it, though. Fleshcrafters. They have a Cleaver ability. That hits friendly targets for a ton of damage. You really want to shoot them into the Stitchworks. Corpse Collectors are back. Make sure we're kicking those again. Stitchworks actually do a lot of damage to the tank, and they put a vulnerability on you. There's also an ability called mob called Rot Spew. Rot Spew, you want to DR anytime it's targeting you with the Rot Spew. The Spew Rot, whatever the name of the ability is. Surgeon Stitchflesh. This is the guy that we're using the spears on. Spear this man. This guy sucks. There's a Zerg strat. Basically, you end up, the first time he comes down, we press our lust. We press all of our offensive CDs. We press triple spear into him. And if we get him below 5% HP, he actually doesn't go back up on the platform. If he's above that, then we're going to have to kill some adds. Basically, there's a hook mechanic from the add where you have to aim the hook directly at Surgeon Stitchflesh to yoink him off the top of the platform. And so making sure that you're hooking him correctly is important. I found a lot of people on the beta do not kill enough adds as well. And so if you don't think you have enough damage to Zerg the boss, you can play it slow. Kill some adds. That'll be good. Now Thor, there's ways to skip the RP of going down. You can skip it with things like instant teleports, with blinks, with rescues, with grappling hook, stuff like that. Human form wild charge also works for druids, so you can actually skip the RP game if you want to. In general, this fight's not too bad. I think this boss is relatively easy. You want to break the shield. You want to pre-spread the bindings. Melee want to stack on top of your tank and move as one. Boralus is back. I think that this is probably going to be the shortest of the dungeon explanations. Spotters notably don't no longer do damage to mobs. It's also Alliance side Boralus, if you're familiar with that from BFA. First trash area, there's 2 mobs that really matter. Blacktar Bombers, Irontide Raiders. Blacktar Bombers do like a random burst of damage on people, and they put a fire patch beneath your feet. You can see who they're going to be damaged to with their throw bomb ability. Irontide Raiders, they do a hook mechanic that does a lot of physical damage to you, and they grip you in. If you get comboed with a Blacktar Bomber at the same time as you're getting hooked in by the Irontide Raider, you can potentially die. But that's all the trash that's in the first area that really matters. For the first boss, we're going to hard focus the Powder Shot casters. We're going to end up kiting Chopper into the bombs, and whenever Chopper Red Hook contacts a bomb, then it takes bonus damage, and so you're going to want to swap off of the Powder Shots onto the boss at that point. You really want to hit Chopper with the damage amp. There's specific times that you really want to meld this boss. I'm not really going to go into it too in depth here, but in theory, in between like the first bomb wave and the second bomb wave starting, you want to like if somebody who's fixated has a meld or a feign death, you want to, or an invis, you want to stop it there. The tank actually also, there's kind of a weird bug that still exists from BFA. The tank actually wants to establish threat onto Chopper. There's this weird situation where a melee DPS or a ranged, if the boss is melded ever in theory and you don't have threat on it, it will white swing on a melee DPS one time. Be careful and just know that that could happen. Second boss trash area. Not too much going on with the second boss trash area. I find it actually all fairly straightforward with what's going on with the second boss trash area. Second boss, I would make sure that you have a snare constantly on the boss to make sure that she doesn't gutshot people. This is a very weird and unknown and archaic mechanic. There's a lot of snares that they added in the game from hero talents that are now just passively applied. Think of things like even like a Bear Druid Thrash slow. Any slow, basically, is what we're looking for here. Additionally, you can take all of the trash that's in front of the boss into the boss, and it's actually not too bad. The spotter is maybe the only annoying mob because it's kind of difficult to get the spotter into the boss, but we can get the spotter on top of the boss in like phase 2, and it's not too big of a deal. There's also an intermission on the boss now at 66 and 33%. So now it's percent based as opposed to time based. Basically, you end up killing the trash, you shoot the cannon, then the boss comes back down off the platform. The trash going into the third boss, the Tempest, it has an ability called Choking Waters. This ability needs to be kicked. Somebody's going to die with basically zero recourse if the Choking Waters go off. The Demolisher is a little bit different now. It does a fear and a tank hit. And so it's a little bit different in how it functions, and so making sure that you're dodging. There's no like frontal tank hit anymore, so it's a lot more lenient. And so you see people doing a very large trash pulls here. There's also Pillagers. A bunch of Pillagers pulled at once can probably wipe you. It has a Shadow Step style effect that puts a disease onto players. In the third boss room, what you want to know is that Hadal no longer patrols. Hadal no longer patrolling is actually very beneficial because now you can actually do the trash a lot easier, and you didn't have to you don't have to pull it back into the alley or anything like that. And so the boss no longer patrolling is a solid change. What most people have been doing is they've been pulling the front right pack with the far left pack, and then doing either skipping that back right pack or pulling it with the boss. One of the two of those things normally ends up happening. So for Hadal, his frontal no longer drops frost patches, which is nice. But the fight is a lot more movement intensive, where in the past it would only summon one wave to clear the ground effect and to dodge. But now it does 2 waves, and so you have to be able to tell in quick succession which wave is going to be coming from which direction first, and then make a fast movement with things like a Wind Rush Tone, like a Stampeding Roar, with just your personal movement speed effect to be able to get to the safe spot for the second one. Last boss is actually a lot better. It no longer infinitely spawns Demolisher tentacles, and so making sure that you just kill off all of the tentacles is the most important thing. You basically don't have a choice. If you don't have all the tentacles cleared off on a platform, then the repair guy won't go and clear those off. But things like a Shadow Priest, like an Aflock, like a Boomy that can multi-dot effectively is actually quite good. So what a lot of people were doing is they were just killing the demo tentacle on each platform and then killing the gripping. There's this weird effect where the slam ability still slams the ground and it does damage and it knocks players back. So that's in general why you want to kill the Demolisher first. But if you're getting good two target cleave and efficient 2-target cleave, you should at least be 2-target cleaving. It's also good to lust platform 1. In the past, people were lusting platform 3. That's no longer any good. Lust platform 1. It's a lot better. You have all of your offensive CDs. They're going to be stacked, and it's going to be able to speed up this boss by the most amount. Of course, if you lusted something else, like, dude, just ignore that part, though. Stonevault. So there's a profession buff in Stonevault, and it is a dwarf or blacksmithing or dark iron dwarf buff, and you get 10% versatility for 10 minutes. And this buff is badass. Probably one of the strongest buffs. This and the mushrooms and Tirna Scithe. There's also, I don't want to say requirements, but it's really nice to have poison dispel or curse dispels in here. You're going to end up needing them. I said poison, but it's curse. So for the first trash area, there's a mob. It's called a Void Soul. It has a fear ability. The fear ability cannot be cast at the same time by multiple Void Souls, and so sometimes you're actually going to want to commit stops to them to have that one specific Void Soul recast its fear over and over again. Alternatively, you can kick the first Void Soul, but know that another Void Soul immediately will start casting their fear ability. The golems that are in the first area also do a large AoE. However, this AoE is outrangeable at 30 yards. Similar to the Void Souls as well, they have anti-sync technology where the golems AoE won't happen at the exact same time. And so you'll see high-end groups actually doing a very, very large first pull. Now, first boss. I'm going to say that this boss scales with healer skill, where if you have very strong players playing like a Resto Shaman or a Preservation Evoker that has a lot of HPS throughput, how you're going to be dealing with this fight is going to be a little bit different. The general premise of this is you break pillars with the lines. Whenever you break a pillar with the line, it puts a dot that does damage to you. The lines themselves, also, whenever they hit you, do a decent amount of damage. And so what the general strat is you blow up the first 3 pillars with the lines. Your healer presses just like nonsense heals on you to be able to top you back up. And then the second set of lines, you blow up 0 of the pillars, and you have them get blown up by the boss's AoE. Whenever they get blown up by the boss's AoE, yes, you're going to have 3 stacks of the debuff on it, but it consolidates all of the damage down, as opposed to you get hit by the line, you have this dot that has to be healed, and then the AoE comes out, 5 seconds later, and instead it's going to be consolidating, making a lot more smooth damage profile if you do it this way, where you blow up the first set of 3 pillars, you then let the second set of 3 pillars get blown up by the boss, and nobody blows them up with the pillar, or with the beam. Now, the reason I said it scales with healer is that Preservoker and Resto Shaman can heal like 5. Heal 5 of these. Whereas some of the other healers, like a Disc Priest or a Resto Druid or whatever, probably only are going to be able to heal like 3. Second trash area, left versus right, going to Skarmorax versus Machinists. It doesn't really matter. You're going to need both of the count. You'll need most of the count in both of these areas anyways. I have personally found that going right, where you have the Machinists first, is better, because we really want this 10% versatility buff. But talking about the trash a little bit, right side trash has a Mender, which has a heal ability. We're going to want to kick this. There's also a Loader, which does like a dodge frontal mechanic and puts a nasty dot on you. There are speakers that are on both sides. The speakers have a gear ability where it will silence a player if they get hit by the gear. This is also a kick that's very nice. Having your healer or any of your ranged DPS get silenced is pretty obnoxious. Left side trash, they're howlers. You really want to kick the whale. It's not too bad. It does like a decent amount of AoE. It stacks over time. In theory, I've never seen more than like 1 stack on the entire group, so if it does go off one time, you're probably not going to wipe. But you do want to kick the whale. There's also a mob that's called a Despoiler. It's a pretty brutal heal check mob with a large lightning AoE. So pressing group externals, group defensives, personal defensives, strong personals, that's important on the Despoiler. Let's talk about Master Machinists. This is a literal raid boss. I think I'm probably going to end up having to make a video talking about this boss specifically. The hard part of this fight, I would say, is the movement. Speaker is the small dude. Speaker casts event ability that creates safe spots around the room. 3 of the 4 events are going to activate at once. The one vent that's not active is not going to have puddles that spawn near it. You're going to take reduced drop-off damage the further you get away from the other active vents. And so moving the boss away from those vents is important. Speaker also has a kick. And then the third ability that Speaker has, it does a box push. And so whenever it does the box push, the box goes straight through the middle. and it comes from whichever side the speaker happens to be on. And so you really want to be like off to the either the north or the south to be able to dodge this box push. After the box gets pushed, speaker will then do an interrupt. You need to have a mage, an Aug-Evoker, a shaman, probably those classes, kick the speaker to be able to deal with it there. There's even times where speaker can jump all the way across the room, and I found it important to even like spatial paradox or interrupt on Aug-Evoker to be able to get that cast interrupted. What happens whenever the cast goes off is that first off you get slowed, but the scarier part is that it actually does a decent amount of AoE damage, and whenever it's combined with the vents, whenever it's combined with Dorito's big AoE, then you probably die. Dorito, big robot, has a frontal. It's similar to the loader where it shoots the orb out, and so dodge the frontal. The big mechanic from Dorito is it does a box pull, not a box push, and so it pulls the box into the middle of the room, and it does like a circle effect. The circle effect then shoots waves out in cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, and you basically have to be standing on top of an event to be able to dodge. You die if you get hit by a wave. You die if you get hit by the box itself. You die if you're in the circle whenever the box goes off. And you also can potentially die if you're not topped. The box's AoE whenever it explodes is insanely deadly, and so you need to make sure that you're popping a very large defensive for this. And this is why I think that I'm going to probably end up having to make a video talking about this boss specifically. Skarmorax. Skarmorax has 3 main mechanics. First and foremost, we kill shards. They put a dot on you, so don't blow up 2 at once. You really want to just kill these one at a time. Enhancement Shaman I have found to be the best spec of the game at killing these shards and like soloing them. Stoke Orbs. So these orbs do damage to you, but what they do is increase your healing done, and then increase your damage dealt to the shield phase. The Void Discharge Shield. Tanks and Aug-Evokers shouldn't soak if you have any of those in your group. The only time you want to soak is if you're a healer and both the other DPS, assuming that you're playing with like an Aug-Evoker. Obviously, that's like a weird assumption to make, but like if you're an Aug-Evoker or a tank, you don't soak. You should not soak realistically more than 3 stacks. I've seen some people go up to 4 and be okay, but realistically, you really don't want to soak more than 3 stacks. If you soak any more than that, the dot's probably going to end up killing you. The Void Discharge Shield is a large AoE, and the shield scales with how many shards you have available. So ideally we have 0 shards. The shield on the boss is very small. We really want to stack up for group healing whenever the Void Discharge Shield phase starts. The boss does like a ramping AoE ability. It does ramping AoE damage. In theory, you don't want to have more than like 5 or 6 stacks of this ramping AoE happen. Last boss trash. I would say it's not too bad. Just make sure that you kill totems. The Rock Smasher, which are the big guys, they put a debuff on you that you cannot extend. It basically makes you take more damage from the Rock Smash ability over and over again. And so if you pull 2 of these at once, you can potentially wipe, and you could be in like a state where there's like a checkmate situation where you end up getting 100 to 0'd because we've stacked up our debuff too far. So you only want to pull these mobs one at a time. Then beyond that, you just like dodge the frontals from the charge guys. Void Speaker. I think this boss isn't too bad. This boss was actually very easy for most of beta, but they ended up changing a couple of the key mechanics for how this fight ends up working later on. Void Speaker, you end up having puddles that you end up dropping. You want to drop these around the room. Honestly, I think that cluttering up the middle of the room is probably your best bet, although there's some instances where you end up wanting to clutter up the sides. There's Void Corruption mechanic, which I've never seen people deal with during heroic dungeons, but the Void Corruption mechanic, you basically walk into the portal and it drops off your debuff and the portal goes away. Now, if you don't drop it off, you have a ramping dot on you, which kills you. So you really want the least durable people to hold on to drop the puddle off immediately as the Void Corruption goes out. Another thing to note with the portal is the portal will take the Void Corruption debuff off of you at a max range of 15 yards, but at 5 yards, basically if you contact the portal itself, the portal will kill you 100 to 0. So that's something that you need to know about that. And that's basically how Void Speaker works. And that's going to be it for Stonevault. And so that's everything you need to know about the dungeons. Again, I'm going to be releasing probably daily Mythic Plus videos talking about things you need to know, talking about tips, talking about how this week is going to fare. I'm going to release a video talking about everything you need to know about affixes. And so if that's something that interests you, again, please like, subscribe, follow the channel. I will be producing a lot more content soon. I hope to see you guys later. Come check out my Twitch as well. I stream fairly regularly. And that's it. Goodbye.